This is the S1 lower, middle, and upper. This is the B1 upper, middle, and lower, and this is a carrier. The file naming system is the screw pieces will start with an S, the blade segments will start with a B, and any other part for the hilt or the handle will start with an H. When you get into specialized designs, that H will be replaced by that design prefix. There's also the longer version of all of these files, with the 1 replaced with a 2 to signify that it's the longer version. So for example, this is the B2 upper, and this is the S2 middle. They're longer than these pieces, which will require a taller printer. You'll need something at least 300 millimeters tall. And anytime you see a 1 or a 2, or an even number or an odd number, that corresponds to the printer height that is required. So an odd number will go towards a 250 millimeter tall printer, and an even number will go towards a 300 millimeter tall printer. When it's complete, the blade will be able to extend and retract back into the handle just by twisting it. Let's take a closer look at what's going on. Here's the saber extended just a little bit of the way. And if we look at the cross-section view, we can see how all the segments and the screws nest into each other. The upper blade segment is the most narrow, and the lower blade segment is the widest. However, the upper screw is the widest, and the lower screw is the most narrow. It is important for the assembly to align the pieces together, not just in the height orientation, but also in the rotational orientation to make sure that everything can collapse and extend correctly. If I collapse the exploded view here, we'll see that the blade segments don't rotate, but the screws do. Let's talk about the anatomy of a blade segment. A blade segment will have the inner threads. This is where the actual screw will thread into. At the base, it has what I call the outer nubs. These nubs will guide it against the inside tube of the next blade segment or carrier. And then on the top side, it has what I call the overhang tabs, which are these 5 parts that stick out, which will guide the blade segment that's inside here in and out smoothly and centered. And then these rails, they go vertically all the way up and down the blade segment. I'll refer to those as the rails. And the next blade segment will click in and out of those rails. The anatomy of the screw has the main screw itself with the threads wrapping around it, then the clips at the base that'll clip into the actual blade segment, and the top side has these cutouts in it to interact with the rails on the inside of the next screw so that all the screws can spin together. All the screws always spin at the same time. So when it comes to the overhang tabs at the top of the blade segment, the outer nubs at the base of the blade segment, the inner diameter threads at the base of the blade segment, and the tops of the screws, these are where things will be sliding against each other. And we want to make sure that everything is fit checked correctly so it slides correctly. These screws will nest inside each other, and we want to make sure that they slide easily. These blade segments will nest inside each other, and we want to make sure that they slide easily. We want to make sure that the interaction between the blade and the screw slides easily. And when you're doing your fit checks, fit check the lower blade segment against the carrier at this point as well. And all of that looks like this. I'll usually start with the outside segments, and as you can see, there's a lot of rubbing there. So we're going to sand this side. I'm putting this blade together upside down first to check how much resistance is on this connection, because there's nubs down here that'll cause more rubbing, and I just want to localize it to just see how much rubbing's here first. We'll deal with this next. I have a little bit of sandpaper. This is 220, and I'm just going to go inside. There you go. So that's sliding freely. Now we'll work on these sides, which has some resistance right now. There we go. Then moving on to the next connection. Bit of rubbing. There we go. Yeah. And then we'll do this bottom edge. Take out that rubbing. All right, then we can test this. And to really test it, I'll line up the seams, click it in. Yeah, that's good. I have my carrier printed off as well. And you'll want to fit the blade to the carrier at this time as well. So we'll do the same thing. We'll sand around this top edge and we'll sand around this bottom edge, make sure everything's sliding correctly. And then we can start moving to the screws. Very nice. Next, we'll need to fit the screw into the segment. Same challenge, there's some rubbing. We want to try to minimize that rubbing. We'll need to sand the inside here, and to do that, I wrap my sandpaper around my knife and use that as the sanding block to get in there. That's what you want. Very good. And we do the same here. There we go. Very nice. And one last time. That's good. One additional fit check everyone should do is to take the lower screw and the lower blade segment and make sure that the threads won't slip. Put some gentle pressure in both directions to make sure that the threads aren't slipping out of the grooves. If the threads are slipping out of the grooves, it might mean that the threads themselves weren't very well formed, or that the inner diameter of the base of the segment is over sanded or printed too large. But if this starts to slip in the final assembly, the blade's not going to work. So this is an important aspect to double check. Okay, we're almost there. The last step is to make sure that these screws can nest inside each other, slide up and down without any extra rubbing. There you go. That's good. And then we'll do this one. There we go. Now we're all set. All the pieces have been sanded and fit checked, so we're ready to start the assembly. Here I have my screw pieces nested inside each other already, and the position of the rails of these screw pieces ensure that there's only one orientation these screws can fit inside each other. So this is correct. I am going to mark it with my Sharpie so that I can keep track of the front and the back, because when we get into the assembly with the actual blade, it's easiest when you keep track of where the front and the back of the blade is. I'm making the black mark where the center screw has the rectangular indent. This signifies the back of the assembly. I'm also going to put a couple black marks where these threads line up at the base of the screw. I want to be able to see where those threads are if I'm just looking top down at this screw. Our first actual assembly step is to insert the upper screw into the middle blade segment. I'm going to lubricate this screw before we do that. Lubrication is really helpful. There is such thing as too much lubrication. There are lubrication tools included in the toolkit, but you can also lubricate with just a toothpick. Here's a closer look at what that takes. This is the lubrication that we're going to use. The first step is I'll just put some globs of lubrication on the tube and I'll spread it around with the toothpick. The toothpick is pretty simple and effective. Start off with that. And I'm really only interested in the screw itself, in the thread itself. The rest of the surface, I'm not trying to spread around to. Just here. So as you can see, it's a little bit messy, and that's okay. There also is such thing as putting too much lubrication on the screw. If there's too much on it, it kind of gets gummed up and it'll actually slow down the whole system in a way that's just not fun. So this, I would say, is a pretty good amount. I'm just going to slowly put this on here. All right. For the next screw, I'll show the lubrication using the tool. So we're going to mount up the bottle into the tool. And this is already primed, so there's already lubrication kind of through these tubes. But I will stick my segment or my screw in here and then kind of squeeze. And just watch it being coated as we go up here. And both threads are getting it. And so if you want to make a lot of these, it really shortens the work here. Because now we're done. Okay, so now we're ready to put these pieces together. And this clip is just going to clip onto the inside here. Make sure it's seated all the way down. And that we can spin. And that's all it is. That's first step, one done. Here's our assembly tool. And it's labeled back and front because it's important to keep track of the rotational orientation of each of the pieces as we go through the assembly. So we'll start talking about the blade in terms of front and back. We want to make sure that the rotational orientation of the blade and the screw are correct towards each other. So if I lock in my assembly tool, and if I did my black marking right, the black marking will correspond to the back of the assembly tool. So it goes over the rails, and that's the only way that it'll fit on the rails. And then I can rotate to the back, and I have my seam aligned with the back of the assembly, but more importantly, the base of the blade segment has this tiny dot right there. That's the back of the assembly. So that's the tiny dot. Here's the back. The tool fits into the screw. That means everything is aligned correctly. Now we can put in the next piece, which is the middle screw that goes right into here. Here's our middle screw. We want to insert it into the center of our assembly. And there's two ways that this could fit in. Because there's two threads, you can kind of feel around for it. And then there it starts to go down. And our black mark is actually facing away from the other black mark now. This moved a little bit, but we look at our black mark, it's seated down in there, and it's facing on the other side of the tiny dot. The tiny dot's up here, which corresponds to our seam, which is over here, and the black dot's on the other side. That's wrong. We don't want that. So we want to back this out, rotate it about 180 degrees, and try to find where it's going to sit again. And there it goes into the threads. And now our black mark lines up with our seam, which lines up to the tiny dot on the bottom. And that's correct. That's what we want. Now the next phase is this: we need to get it into the other screw. And my other screw shifted a little bit because of how I was moving everything around. But initially we had our outer screw lined up correctly. So we want these black dots to line up again. And so it's going to be a little bit tricky to kind of get everything moving around here. Furthermore, I've started adding a little bit more lubrication to anything where I think it needs wear resistance. And so I've started to add lubrication up to this upper rim. So I'll dab a little bit in right now. So now I just need to kind of coerce this outer screw so that it can align and that these two pieces can nest together. Like that. So now those screws are nested inside each other. The black marks are aligned. The small hole signifies the back of the blade. This is all correct. Now we're ready for our lower screw. And again, I just lubricated this. We'll insert into the center. I'll add a little bit of lubrication around the top edge just for wear resistance. And then we'll drop it in. Again, making sure that all the black segments are aligned. And the rails, again, the rails only align one way. So that's going to go in there. Here's our assembly tool again. And since we know that this is the back of the blade assembly, we're going to hold the assembly tool with the back label facing upwards. We're going to stick it into the assembly and twist it one full revolution so that the screws have one full revolution, which is going to separate the hypothetical blade segments one revolution, and that'll give us enough space for the next phase of the assembly. And that looks like this. So this space is one revolution down for both screws. The back, we have our tiny dot for the back of the assembly. The back of the assembly is still here. That's all orientated correctly. The last area of extra lubrication that I'll do is right here on the nubs and in between the nubs. Before I put on the next blade segment. Here's our lower blade segment. And again, we want to keep the orientation aligned with the back of the blade. I have the seam line in the back of my blade, but it also is signified by the smallest hole in the base. The smallest hole is the back of the assembly. So that's the orientation. I'm about to slide this on, but I'm also going to need to twist it on to get it onto these threads. So these threads are rotating this way. So I'm going to have to move with the threads down, move about a quarter of a turn away from myself. So then when I get it back on, I can twist it on and the back of the blade still lines up just for that last bit. So I'll twist it about a quarter of a turn away from myself, put it on here. And then I'll feel for the threads. Right there. And it just goes in. And clicking it over the rails. Now my seams are lined up with the back, which is good. But I got almost nothing sticking out of here because I'm still 1 revolution down. So this segment has to catch 1 revolution back up. So I'm going to keep twisting it and keep clicking it over the rails for 1 more revolution. Okay, so now my back, my seam, my small hole, everything's lined up correctly. To double check, grab your second piece of the assembly tool and put it over here. Those heights should line up. If those heights line up, you'll know that everything's put together correctly. If it doesn't line up, this segment might need to be rotated 180 degrees. You might need to take it back off, rotate it 180 and put it back on, because this height should match. The back seams should all match, and the back label should be here. That means you're on the right track. So the only thing left is to just click the second screw into the blade. And to do that, I'll switch this around. I have my wider end here that'll go into my blade segment, and I'll push it against my other assembly tool to make that clip. And then I have the blade working like that. So I'll extend this all the way out and we'll put on our top green segment. Here's our upper blade segment. This is the final piece to put on. I have the rounded tip version. I did lubricate the outer nubs here just a little bit. And it also has a little dimple right here to signify the back of the assembly so we can keep track of where everything is. I have my seam line kind of intersecting with that dimple, so it's a little bit hard to see, but it's right kind of at the tip of my thumb there. Now, when you do this, the blade needs to be in the fully extended position. And this time I'll rotate the top segment instead of a quarter turn this way, like we did with the base segment. I'm going to rotate it a quarter turn this way and kind of get it in there and feel around for the threads until I can get onto the threads, and then click it into place. And so now all my seams line up and we're done. It's working.